It was past midnight in the Cooke household when Charles heard it. He had gotten up for a glass of water. The house was completely silent, and then, coming from behind his son's bedroom door, a sound that stopped him where he stood. He didn't knock. He didn't open the door. He just stood there in the dark hallway, listening. And everything he thought he knew about his son changed in that moment. He stood there for a long time, long enough that his feet went cold on the wooden floor, long enough that the glass of water he had come for was completely forgotten. He couldn't move, not because he was afraid, because he understood, in the way that certain moments demand to be understood, that if he opened that door, if he made a sound, if he let his son know he was there, something would end. Something that needed to keep going just a little longer. Charles Cooke was not a man who was easily moved. He had preached through floods and funerals and the particular grief that settles over communities that had been asked to endure too much for too long. He had stood at pulpits and delivered words that made grown men weep. He was not a man who surprised easily, which is why what happened in that hallway was so extraordinary, because Charles Cooke, the preacher, the father, the man who thought he had heard everything, was standing outside a door with tears on his face. Clarksdale, Mississippi, in the early 1930s was a place that asked a great deal of the people who lived there and gave very little in return. It was a town shaped by poverty and segregation and the particular heaviness that settles over places where the rules are clear and the penalties for breaking them are severe. The black community in Clarksdale built what they could inside those boundaries: families, churches, music, the kind of life that exists not despite hardship, but through it, constructed carefully, maintained with dignity, passed down from one generation to the next like something precious, because it was. Charles Cooke had come to Clarksdale as a young man with a voice of his own and a calling he took seriously. He became a preacher the way some men become soldiers, not because it was the easiest path, but because it was the only path that made sense for who he was. He built a congregation. He built a family. He married Annie, a woman of quiet strength who understood her husband completely and complimented him in all the ways that matter. Together they had children, several of them, filling the small house on the unpaved street with noise and life and the particular chaos of a family that is, despite everything, fortunate.
Samuel was not the oldest. He was not the first to sing or the first to show promise or the first to stand in front of a congregation and open his mouth. He was, in many ways, simply one of several, a small boy in a house full of children, absorbed into the daily rhythm of a family that had too much to do and not enough time to do it. Charles loved all his children. He provided for them. He guided them with the firm, unsentimental love of a man who understood that the world outside his door was not kind, and that kindness alone would not prepare them for it. He taught them discipline. He taught them faith. He taught them that dignity was not something the world gave you, but something you built and maintained yourself, regardless of what the world decided you deserved. He thought he knew his children completely. He thought he knew Samuel. He was wrong. The night it happened, Samuel was 5 years old. The house had gone quiet in the particular way that houses go quiet when large families finally exhaust themselves into sleep, gradually, room by room, until the last light goes out and the only sounds are the settling of old wood and the breathing of people who have earned their rest. Charles had fallen asleep early. He had preached twice that day and visited 3 families in the afternoon, and his body had made its needs clear before his mind was quite ready to listen. He woke sometime after midnight with the simple, ordinary need for water. He rose carefully, moving with the practiced silence of a man who has learned not to wake a sleeping household. He pulled on his robe, he stepped into the hallway, and the sound found him. It was coming from Samuel's room. The door was closed, as it always was, as Charles insisted all doors be closed at night, but the sound passed through it as easily as if the door were not there at all, as if wood and distance were simply irrelevant to whatever was producing it. It was a voice, Samuel's voice, but a version of that voice that Charles had never heard before. He had heard Samuel sing hundreds of times, in church, in the yard, in the kitchen where Annie sometimes played hymns on the old upright piano that took up too much space and that nobody could bring themselves to remove. He had heard Samuel sing the way he heard all his children sing, with the half attention of a parent who is always listening for the specific sounds of crisis and filtering out everything else. He had registered that Samuel had a voice. He had registered, in the vague way that parents register such things, that the voice was pleasant, that it was perhaps better than average. He had not registered this. What was coming through that door was not the voice of a 5-year-old child singing himself to sleep. It was something that had no business coming from a body that small. It was full and controlled, and moving through the melody with a sureness that belonged to someone who had been doing this for decades, not years. But more than the technical impossibility of it, more than the range, more than the control, there was something else. Something that Charles Cooke, preacher, recognized immediately and had no words for.
The voice was carrying something, something real, something that went beyond the notes and the melody and the simple act of singing. It was the quality he had heard in perhaps 3 or 4 voices in his entire life, the quality that made a congregation go still, that made the air in a room change, that made people feel that what they were hearing was not just music, but something closer to truth. And it was coming from his 5-year-old son, alone in his bedroom, in the middle of the night, singing to no one. Charles stood in that hallway for a very long time. He thought about opening the door. Several times he raised his hand toward it and then lowered it again, not because he was afraid of what he would find. He knew what he would find, a small boy in a small bed, eyes perhaps closed, singing the way children sing when they are alone and unobserved and completely themselves. He didn't open the door because he understood that the moment he did, something would shift. Samuel would become aware of being heard. The singing would change, would become conscious, performed, directed at an audience of one. And the thing that Charles was hearing right now, the thing that was making his feet go cold on the wooden floor and his throat tightened in a way he did not entirely understand, existed only because Samuel did not know he was being listened to. So Charles listened. He listened until the song ended. He listened through the silence that followed. A silence that felt different from ordinary silence, fuller somehow, as if the sound had changed the air and the air was still settling. He listened to the small sounds of a child shifting in a bed, pulling a blanket, moving toward sleep. And then he stood there a little longer, in the dark hallway, with the now warm wooden floor under his feet and the forgotten glass of water still somewhere in his future. And he thought about what he had just heard. He thought about the congregation members he had watched over the years, people who had been given particular gifts and used them well or poorly, had honored them or wasted them, had understood what they were carrying or had never quite grasped it. He thought about the voices he had heard in gospel churches across Mississippi, the rare ones, the ones that made a room go still, the ones that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the person producing them. He had heard perhaps 4 or 5 voices like that in his entire life, voices that made you feel that music was not something being performed, but something being channeled, something passing through a person on its way to somewhere else. He was a preacher. He had spent his entire adult life speaking about gifts, about the things that come to certain people, not because they earned them or deserved them more than others, but simply because some gifts choose their recipients in ways that no human logic can fully explain. He had preached about this concept hundreds of times. He thought he understood it.
Standing in that hallway, he understood it differently. He understood it the way you understand something when it stops being abstract and becomes the small boy sleeping on the other side of a closed door. A woman named Clara, who was a close friend of Annie Cooke and who heard this story from Annie years later, described Charles's state the following morning. She said Annie had come downstairs to find her husband already awake, sitting at the kitchen table before sunrise, which was unusual. His coffee was untouched and had gone cold. He was simply sitting, hands folded on the table, eyes on the middle distance, the expression of a man working through something that did not have a simple resolution. Annie had stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, watching him. She had been married to this man long enough to know the difference between the silences that needed to be broken and the ones that needed to be honored. She poured herself a cup of coffee. She sat down across from him. She waited. Charles had looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "Nothing is wrong." He said, "I heard Samuel last night." Annie had looked at him, and she had nodded slowly, in the way of someone who has been waiting for a particular conversation for a long time and is relieved it has finally arrived. She already knew. Of course she already knew. Mothers always know first. She had known since Samuel was 2 years old and had hummed an entire hymn in perfect pitch before he could properly form the words to go with it. She had known, and she had waited, patiently, for the moment when Charles would hear what she had been hearing all along. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't say anything at all. She simply reached across the table and placed her hand over his, and they sat there together in the early morning quiet of a house where, 1 floor above them, their extraordinary son was sleeping. Charles Cooke never told Samuel what he had heard that night, not that morning, not in the weeks and months that followed, not as Samuel grew and the voice grew with him, and the thing that Charles had heard through the closed door became increasingly impossible to ignore or explain away. He watched his son instead, quietly, carefully, the way he watched everything, with the patient attention of a man who understood that most important things reveal themselves gradually if you give them the space to do so. He watched Samuel in church, where the voice began to draw attention from the congregation in ways that Charles noted without acknowledging. He watched Samuel in the yard, in the kitchen, in the small moments of an ordinary childhood where a boy might break into song without thinking about it and then stop, suddenly self-conscious, aware that someone was listening. Charles never made him self-conscious. He never stared too long or reacted too visibly. He simply watched and listened and held inside himself the knowledge of what he had heard in that hallway. Because Charles Cooke understood something that would take the rest of the world years to understand. That the voice he had heard through that door was not to him to claim or direct or shape according to his own vision of what his son's life should look like. That a gift of that magnitude arrived with its own direction already built in. That the most important thing a father could do, perhaps the hardest thing a father could do, was to understand that some things belong to the person who carries them, not to the person who raised them. Sam Cooke grew up, and the voice went with him, out of Clarksdale and into the world, onto stages and into recording studios, and across the airwaves of a country that did not fully deserve what it was hearing, but received it anyway. The voice became famous. It became legendary. It became one of those rare things that outlasts the person it came from, that continues to move through the world long after the body that produced it is gone. Charles Cooke lived to see some of that.
He lived to hear his son's voice on the radio, to watch him perform, to witness the world's response to something he had first encountered alone in a dark hallway in Clarksdale, Mississippi, in the middle of the night, standing outside a closed door with cold feet and forgotten glass of water and tears on his face. He never told Sam about that night, or if he did, Sam never spoke of it publicly. That moment belonged to Charles, to the father standing in the hallway, understanding for the first time that his son was carrying something extraordinary, and choosing, in his wisdom and his love, to simply step back and let it go where it needed to go. Some fathers push their children toward greatness. Some fathers build the stages and arrange the lights and make sure the world is watching. Charles Cooke did something harder. He stood in a dark hallway and listened, and then he stepped back and he let the voice find its own way. And the voice, as voices like that always do, found exactly where it needed to go. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe. Every day we tell the stories behind the music, the private moments that shaped the legends. Hit the like button if you believe that the greatest thing a parent can do is recognize something in their child and step back to let it grow. And tell us in the comments, did you ever have someone who believed in you before you believed in yourself? Because Sam Cooke had that, in a dark hallway, in the middle of the night. We'll see you in the next one.